Okay, so hello everybody, and thank you for watching. Today we're going to be talking about vocabulary. We're going to be talking about how many words students should or ideally learn at GCSE, which words they might be if we want them to be confident, capable, motivated, interested linguists, and also what kind of words students might learn or be exposed to in lessons around year 7 to 11 in that GCSE, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 phase. The reason we're talking about this relates to the proposals relating to the new MFL GCSE, particularly around the idea of a specified word list, probably around 1,500 to 2,000 words. And we're filming this before the official consultation comes out. So forgive us for any sort of slight inaccuracies in that, but we're basing that on good faith on what's been said publicly already. I think it's a really important issue in MFL, one that I find really interesting, and I'm delighted to be joined in this video by Ruth, who's a head teacher of a school in England and MFL teacher as well, an absolute advocate for the role of languages in a universal curriculum. And Ruth, I understand you've been teaching since the late 1980s.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm equally delighted to be joined by Professor Jim Milton, Professor of Applied Linguistics, who I think has just retired from the University of Swansea, who has got good 30 years of research and publishing on exactly this issue, vocab acquisition, teaching and learning, including in UK classrooms and UK MFL classrooms. So what better discussion really for us to have, and what better people could I possibly have it with? So I'd like, without further ado, to hand over to Ruth. And we've prepared some questions, Ruth, about vocab lists, GCSEs, and confidence and communicability. Over to you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm delighted to talk to you about this, Jim. As a head teacher, I'm really concerned, obviously, about outcomes in languages, but as a languages teacher, predominantly about motivation and uptake, and we know that won't happen unless pupils experience success, and success breeds enjoyment, etc. So sort of framing the questions around that. I wonder what you think about, first of all, I mean, it sounds a really great idea, a defined, specified word list. What do you think are the pros and cons of
Well, if you have a language specification or any type of learning specification, you'd think that ought to be a good thing. You can then teach towards it. You can test whether people are making good progress towards it. But in a modern foreign language, or any language, it's actually quite hard to specify exactly what it is that's going to be said or heard when you use your language. It's quite rare to be able to do that. Something like airline pilot English would be an example, where the pilots have to say exactly specified things in exactly the right way, or it goes wrong. So actually, you don't often see complete vocabulary specification. In fact, I can't think of any. What you normally see is a core list. So there's a body of material around which teachers, exam boards, books will build a path to vocabulary knowledge so you get fluency. And I guess the question is whether the list that Ollie has just described, where you've got 1,500 odd words that are heavily weighted towards the most frequent words, without any kind of obvious thematic content, whether that's going to be an appropriate structure for a lexicon that will be useful for learners to get to B1 level. That's the target of modern foreign language GCSE. It's probably going to end up being fairly prescriptive, because if the content of the exam is going to be these words, then that's what teachers will tend to teach to. So are those 1,500 words going to be a good model for you to work towards? Is it going to be successful? And I fear the answer may be no. And there are two reasons for that. One is the composition. Is it the right choice of words? And the second is an issue simply of size. Are there enough of them? So the composition is really asking the question, is it an appropriate choice of words to allow you to do the things that CEFR B1 wants you to do? And it's quite demanding what those specifications are. So you've got to express personal opinions, exchange information on topics, quite a wide variety of topics, families, hobbies, work, travel, current affairs. It's quite demanding. And to be honest, if you've only got the most frequent words, you haven't got the content vocabulary, then you're going to struggle to express yourself on almost anything.
Yeah.
Even if you're working within those 1,500 words, you may be sure that real French people or real German people speaking real German and French are not going to be doing that. They're going to be using a whole lot of this less frequent vocabulary you haven't learned, and you won't understand anything.
So
we were talking about this before, and we have a slide on this one. It's like those old-fashioned slideshows used to get. So if you put up slide 1, where what we've got is a graph of what it is that learners' vocabulary actually looks like when they're doing, in this case, it's French B1. And there are 2 lines there. Well, actually, I should explain what you've got is it shows word knowledge along the first 5,000 frequency bands. So what you've got, if you look at the orange line, this is what Greek learners of French at B1 look like. And yes, they know a fair proportion of that frequent vocabulary in levels 1 and 2, the first 2,000 words. They don't know it all, but they know a good proportion of it. But what they've got is an awful lot of knowledge in levels 3, 4, 5, and if you extrapolate beyond that more as well. So, and actually they need that to talk about those current affairs, to talk about travel, all the other things that B1 expects you to talk about. And if you don't have sorry, go on, Ruth.
So Jim, thinking about the number of words is clearly an issue. What are the issues around the corpora that they're based on? What words they are. That's also important.
Well, this is what that graph tells you is that you don't have a working lexicon with just most frequent vocab. You need this content, this less frequent vocabulary as well. And actually you won't have a working lexicon without that.
And how reliable and useful are even those lists of the top 1,000, 2,000 words? Where on earth do they come from? And are they suitable for learning languages in Britain in 2020 or 2021 and beyond?
I mean, that honestly depends how you're using your corpus and your word list. I mean, I think they're usually rather well devised. And they do useful things for you. So long as you treat them intelligently, because they're not going to actually give you a route through learning. So you're not going to learn the words in strict frequency order any more than you would learn a lexicon in strictly alphabetical order. That would be silly.
That strikes me as a key point, that just because a word is more frequent doesn't mean I should learn it first. Can you talk us through that?
Well, that's right. But what you need is I don't think, but all the evidence shows, what you need is to construct a lexicon or construct teaching materials from which you will derive your lexicon, which is going to have a wide variety of this content vocabulary as well as that frequent vocabulary. You can't avoid that frequent vocabulary. It's everywhere in language. That's why it's frequent. But you also want that content vocabulary so that you have the capability of talking about something and understanding when someone talks to you about something. If you haven't got it, you'll be lost.
One of the frustrations that our pupils have is that they very quickly realise that the limitations of what they can do, and that becomes frustrating and then proves a barrier. So what kind of input do you think, Jim, or does your work tell you that they need in order to reach those levels of fluency that are going to satisfy them and encourage them to go further?
Well, it's interesting you talked in terms of input, because input and uptake aren't the same thing. It's not like making widgets. We always talk about making widgets. If you have a ton of metal, you can make a ton of widgets. But if you teach 1,000 words in a foreign language, your learners are not all going to learn 1,000 words. They're going to learn less. And the evidence we've got is that it depends a lot on what you do and how you organize your teaching. And there are a couple of figures to kind of work with on this one of which is that simply in terms of the knowledge you need, learners are going to need at least 2,000 words just to hit the point where they can begin to be understood or to understand what's some kind of just understanding. It's an absolute basic threshold. And without that, you're going to experience as a learner that you're not making progress at all. If you want to become in any way kind of fluent or communicate easily, you're probably going to need 5,000 words or more. And these are figures that work for English, they work for French. So you'll realize that if you know 5,000 words, you're automatically going to have a mixture probably of frequent and infrequent vocabulary. If you're working to that 2,000 figure, you've kind of got a choice to make. But you want a range. You're still going to want a mixture of this frequent and less frequent.
And the figure you mentioned in one of your books, Jim, I think it was one. I think you called it a rule of thumb. In fairness, but you mentioned in there in one of your chapters that good teaching materials tend to have about 50% frequent words and about 50% infrequent words. That sounds very different to what government or NSELP are proposing at the moment.
Yes, they're proposing something very different, and my fear is that it'll be very damaging, because if you remove that content vocabulary, language has to be about something. You've got to talk about something. There's got to be a theme, a topic, a subject. If you take that away, then what are you using your language for? It is possible to create what looks like language from that highly frequent vocabulary, but it's always going to be rather artificial and contrived. So it's not going to sound natural, and you're going to struggle to communicate. In fact, I'd go further. You probably won't communicate with just a lexicon within those first 2,000 words. So you're going to need more. But if you want to get that more, then in successful examples of where we've got good course book input, it's always a lot of thematic variation, quite high rates of vocabulary input, like 8, 10, 12 words per contact hour. And then what you get is uptake of about 50%. So if you want your learners to learn 2,000, you've got to teach at least 4,000. And you've got to teach a variety, because that's what gives it the potential for interest that enables people to sort of stick with it and learn. If you want to learn 5,000, then you've got to find probably maybe 10,000 words. It's a lot.
So if you could do something, just one thing to improve proficiency at GCSE, what would you recommend?
Well, learn more words. I mean, actually, there was another point I was going to make on that last one. I'm going to finish that because it's kind of important, because we've been talking about a 50% uptake rate. In British schools, where we know we've examined the content of course book, we've had a look at several of them, they're typically, they have very small thematic variation, quite low rates of input. You get whole years where there isn't any input, and the uptake rate is nothing like 50%. In fact, I did a study published in 2006 where we know the intake from Encore Tricolore, and we know the uptake, and it was 17%. So if you take out this variety, this interest, this variation, these high rates of input, you actually get low rates of learning. Students don't make the progress they should be making. British students aren't stupid, but their input isn't good enough for them to learn well.
This contradicts, though, the other thing that we kind of inherently know as practitioners, though, that if we want students to learn a word, we have to show it to them several times, and that's also what the linguistics research tells us. So how do we square that circle that we need both variety and double, and our input should be double our intended uptake, yet we also need to know that we need to show them those important words several times a week, year, throughout their school career?
But I don't think there's a huge contradiction in that, because certainly a lot of those most frequent words are going to be repeated anyway, because they're essential to all language. So
by virtue of them being frequent, they will appear anyway, right?
Yeah. So you can choose as many themes as you like, and probably that most frequent stuff is going to be present. If it's not present, it's not going to be French, or it's not going to be English. So I don't think there's no problem having wide thematic range. I think there's a lot of benefits that you're going to get because of the potential for making the language more realistic, more natural, and the content of teaching more interesting. Once you lose your learners, if your learners don't want to learn, there's nothing you can do that's going to make them learn. But if you make it interesting, relevant, credible, they'll learn.
So
Does that make
that
sense?
kind of leads into topics, really, because we've been very used to teaching topics and assuming that each topic carries with it certain range of lexis and so on, but and then grammar's usually sort of shoehorned into that somehow as well. But what do you think of the pros and cons of topics in a GCSE curriculum?
Well, I can see very few cons. There are real benefits from having topics. One is that you get access to all of this content vocabulary that you're going to need if you actually want to talk about something. It is has the potential for creating interest and motivation, and that's crucial. And you get this higher rate of uptake, which is what you want. You don't want to make your students learn less and less. No. You do want to do that. And certainly with a good range of content and vocabulary, the language you're presenting for learning is going to be less contrived and artificial than you would get with topics, because you're going to be choosing the words that actually native speakers of the language are going to be using, rather than something else to get round the potential problem of avoiding words. It's a feature of the advice that teachers get, is that they should avoid this topic vocabulary. And because it's actually do you remember the old SILTs, the Centre of Information on Language Teaching Research? They used to run a one-day course on the dangers of teaching vocabulary, like you'd lose a leg if you did it. And actually there are no dangers, there are a lot of benefits to doing that. And the only possible downside is if you choose a set of topics so badly that actually it's relevant to nothing within that specification of the CEFRB1.
Too much repetition of topics, maybe.
Well, if you're constantly revisiting them, then automatically you're not giving yourself the chance to introduce as much vocabulary as you want.
And also I think we've seen topics which speak to a certain set of learners and resonate with a certain set of learners far more than others. Holidays, hobbies, home life, that kind of thing.
Well, yes, you don't have to do that. There's nothing wrong with those as topics, but there's a whole lot of other things you can do as well. And the good EFL books that I look at a lot, they rotate, they churn over these topics. So they have things on footballers, and once those footballers drop out of fashion, there's a new set of footballers in there. They expect to turn over their course books quite quickly, and they keep the content current. And a feature of looking at the French books, that Encore Tricolore book, which I was referring to, seemed to be in use for 30 years.
A long time. But it's also, I think, increasingly perhaps that pupils seek and should be able to expect topics that take them out of themselves and into the culture of the language that they're studying.
Well, I would hope so, and students are normally open to being interested, to be sold on these things. So I don't see why you can't take that and use it if you give yourself the opportunity to do it.
Approach, Jim, to vocabulary would you advise on the basis of your research and other research?
But there's no question, if you want people to succeed in learning a foreign language, they're going to need to grow a vocabulary of an appropriate size, if possible better. The more words you have, the better you get. There's a very strong relationship between that.
More so than on grammar, Jim, because often it's sold to us that grammar is a thing which conveys meaning, but
well, you try conveying meaning without words and you'll soon find that no amount of grammar is going to do that. You can just about manage with words and no grammar, but you can't manage with no words and just grammar. So actually, the more words you teach, the better it's going to be. If you have more words, you'll get higher grades, you'll reach a higher level. It explains more variance in grades and level than any other factor we know in language, so it's really crucial. So the first thing you want to do,
grade thresholds are often based on grammatical proficiency more so than Lexis. But I think what you're saying is that that doesn't really help in terms of developing fluency, and it's kind of very off-putting.
Well, I rather suspect that you can't develop all of this grammatical fluency if you haven't got a vocabulary of the right size. You have to have all of the examples. You've got to see the rules, and to be able to use them. It's no good having grammar that you can't use. So yeah, you're going to have to grow that, and growing more words is going to give you a better chance of being better in your language. So the first thing you want to do, if you're a teacher, is to choose a book which has the most words in. Because
and actually books seem to have got thinner over the years, haven't they?
That's what our evidence shows. So yes, the latest set of books that we looked at, Ollie and I had a go at looking at some books. So do we name names here? Name and shame? Why not? It's the studio textbook we looked at. It only had 1,749 words in over 5 years, which is a remarkably slight input, and it was 40% down on something like Encore Tricolore, which itself looked to be about 50% down on the content of textbooks for O-level from 40 years ago. So they are getting thinner and thinner. If you put in less vocabulary, your learners will learn less vocabulary, and the less able they will be. So you want to put in books with words.
It all sounds great, but we've got, if we're lucky, 2 hours a week, and in many schools much less than that. So surely 1,500, 2,000 words sounds already pretty ambitious. But I mean, are you sort of saying that we can't both kind of have our cake and eat it? We can't say that GCSE is B1 or maybe A2, but only 1,500 words.
The lack of time is only one of the problems you've got. Even within those 2 classes per week of roughly that you get, 330 odd hours for a 5-year scheme, the input of vocabulary is still smaller than it is in equivalent courses elsewhere. So we're actually making a demand on our learners that is maybe half the volume that they would get somewhere else. And the fact that other countries teach more vocabulary means that they learn more vocabulary, and that's one of the reasons they're better. Additionally, they tend to have more time. So they have even more time to make better use of the more vocabulary they're learning. We've got lost in a kind of vicious circle of decline. You teach less, we get less uptake, we devote less hours, fewer hours, and standards keep falling.
So what if you were writing this new GCSE content criteria or specification, Jim, what would you be saying? Learn more than 2,000 words, or reduce the ambition of the specification and stick to 2,000 words, or what? What are the options?
If the goal of that GCSE is really CEFR B1, then there's not a problem having a vocabulary specification that includes the 1,500 or so words of most frequent words for the first 2,000, but you want an equal number of less frequent words, preferably arranged as around a set of themes and topics that we can all work to, which will allow you to construct a good teaching syllabus and good teaching materials to get you where you want to go.
And is there an international example where kind of 3,000 words or so is learnable on the sort of time that we have in UK classrooms, or do we basically need more time?
I think with what would you get with? I think it's perfectly feasible to expect your learners to, in your 330 hours, well used with good teaching materials, you multiply that by about 4, isn't it? That'll get you up to 12 or 1,500 words. So they could learn 12 or 1,500 words, but remember that's double what they know now.
Yeah, what they're actually going to know. Yeah.
Well, right now, when we test learners taking GCSE, they know in good schools about 800 words, in less good schools about 500. So if you do a good job and you put in 3,000 words, they can learn 1,500 of them in that time, and that'll be 4 or 5 words per contact hour. That's doable.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting that we're not doing it. And one of the reasons we're not doing it is that we're not actually trying, because the content of the textbook is so thin.
You had some other evidence in your pack. Do you want to just briefly talk us through what that was, Jim?
Well, yeah, this is a study I did with Tammy Alexi, where we were looking at uptake in other countries. This is French as a foreign language, and we were looking to see what levels of vocabulary did they know at each of the 6 levels of the CEFR. And we did this in French, learners of French in Spain, learners of French in Greece, and learners of French in the UK. And in France and Spain, the knowledge looked a lot like the knowledge of English. So when these aren't people who've taken the exam. These are people who are aspiring to be B1. They're taking a course at B1. But you'll see at B1, they know in both France and Greece, sorry, both Spain and Greece, over 2,000 words, approaching 2,500 words. Which is where it has to be. B1 requires you to be an independent learner. You can't be independent with less than 2,000 words. And that B2 level, which is our A level, they've got over 2,500 words. So it makes sense. It fits in with everything else we know. And the contrast with French learners doing B1 and B2 in UK could not be more obvious, because learning, particularly at that B1 level, is so slight. I've actually got 950 words there. That was in a grammar school in Oxford, if I remember.
Yeah, so on average it's going to be less again.
And it is normally less when we test it,
And again, the key thing is here, just because we teach 1,800 words on a vocab list doesn't mean, of course, that's what they're going to know at the end of it. Probably going to know about half.
I'm not a betting man, Ollie, but I would put my house that you wouldn't get 1,500 words of learning from 1,500 words of income. So, yeah.
And this is a summary, if I understand it, of kind of what typically vocab size goes with what level of the Common European Framework. So if what you say is right, Jim, that if we focus our teaching on a vocab list which is 2,000 words or fewer, then actually at best what we're looking at is A1. That's nothing like the A2 B1 that even Ofqual says GCSE is.
Yeah, but GCSE, I've had this argument with people who devise these things over 15 years, 20 years. The placing of this at CFR B1 is wrong. It can't possibly be anything more than A1. And it's the vocabulary levels that I'll tell you where it is. And yes, you're exactly right, Ollie. If you know fewer than 1,500 words, you're going to be A1, because the number of words you have makes you incapable of communication other than the most contrived kind, and limited kind. So it's the GCSE exam is at A1.
But I think we know this, and we can feel it. But most importantly, the students themselves can feel it. And then and so their frustration sets in very early, and that's why they don't really want to continue. Even if they're compelled to continue as part of a core curriculum, and they take a GCSE, they haven't got what they need to be interested enough.
Well, it almost feels as well like we give them the vocab, which is A1, but then expect the skills in terms of fluency of B1. So of course they're going to find it hard, because they've been asked to be able to do something that they just can't do with the type of vocab which they've got, which is why we get students kind of, they might be spontaneous, but they're spontaneous on things that they've rehearsed, which is, holidays they've never been on, or that kind of thing. Being devil's advocate for a second then, let's say, all right, hands up, GCSE is actually just A1, maybe A2 for the very best grades, and what we're aiming at, if we're lucky, is about 1,500 words, right? And then maybe we could say, I suppose, in theory, we could, be a brave government, but they could say, all right, GCSE is A1, and then we'll move to A2 and B1 at A level. If we were just teaching or aiming for about 1,500 words uptake, Jim, should those words be mainly from the top 2,000, or do you still maintain that it should be that balance?
No, I think it still has to be balanced, and I've come to that conclusion based on what I see as successful language courses.
I guess we come back to this graph, don't we?
Yeah, we come back to that graph, and we come back to what it is that enables you to develop a lexicon that looks like that.
So actually, right from the start, we're looking at the sort of roughly 50-50 split.
I think at the start, it's much later on. You have to work hard to keep adding infrequent words, which is why the expectation is that you'll do a lot more reading or something to wordless learning, whatever it is. But at the start, you still have to have that content vocabulary,
Yeah.
Otherwise, you've got nothing to see. You can do nothing with that language, and it's
No.
uninteresting. You try learning just a word list, an
Yeah.
unconnected word list.
Mm.
It's not going to grab you. And
No.
I think the interesting thing is that line at the bottom, which is UKB. Well, this is what a B1 person in Britain looks like taking GCSE, and it's very different from that Greek equivalent. But I could have put the Spanish one in there. They're very, very similar. Even though they've had such a very highly distorted input, distorted towards those most frequent words, they're still developing a lexicon that looks like a normal lexicon.
Yeah.
Or both. Because if you don't have both, you can't do anything. When they have an exam, if there's a reading comprehension, the reading comprehension has to be about something.
Yeah.
If you've got to have a speaking test, you've got to talk about something. And you can't talk about something without that content vocabulary.
Yeah.
So that's the one. That's just one of the problems with the word specification as it's envisaged, is that it doesn't have any of that content vocabulary. The second thing is the whole size issue, which is tied up with teaching time. But even with the time that we've got, we can do better because our input is so small.
Yeah.
And it seems unlikely where you make your learners do more and they'll like it, but they will because it makes more sense and they will make better progress. So it's painfully slow. It's rather meaningless and random at the moment. You can impose much more direction, more purpose. You can actually reward them for doing better with the type of test that Ollie and I have been playing with. There's these are things that look like they don't really look like games, but they're things you can do quickly and easily, and you come up with a result. You can do these things, but you can do more with what we have available.
Yeah.
That's been a fascinating conversation. I've learned absolutely tons. Ruth, did you have any more questions from a head or language teacher's point of view?
No, I mean, at the end of it, that's a really positive and exciting note to end on, that, there is a way that we could do this. There is a way that we can change the way we approach language teaching and the way we think about it, and make it more, less fear about it. Because I think teachers are a little bit fearful of more content because they think
I think they will. But Ruth, remember, one of the issues you're dealing with is that the Department for Education curriculum guidelines don't contain anything about vocabulary. And it's very difficult for teachers to teach something where there's just no guidelines at all, because anything you do is potentially wrong. So actually, one of the things that would help a lot is to have better specification. Unfortunately, what we're being offered is going in the wrong direction. It can be improved. It can be made better. Let's hope it is made better.
We hope so, because we all want the same thing, which is more and better linguists, people who love languages as much as we do.
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Very grateful for your time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? There's a story behind this. If you want a story, do we have time for an anecdote? Yeah, because I've had over the years a lot of Saudi students, and we've always wondered why it is vocabulary uptake in Saudi schools was just so slow. And it wasn't just us. This was a thing that they had ample hours of teaching, 900 contact hours, but an uptake of only about 1,000, 1,200 words. And I had a student who, he was actually looking to model difficulty in words, and we kept coming back to frequency. And we really wanted to look at the textbooks. Abdullah Al-Saifi was called. He's a very bright chap. And I said, we really need to look at the textbooks, but the ministry will never let us loose on that. We'll criticize them. And he said, oh, don't be so sure. And he came back the following day with a pen drive with all the books in digital format, so we were able to look at them, and it told us a lot about why things were the way they were. So there was very little input. The whole input over 900 hours was only 3,500 words. It was very heavily skewed to the most frequent words. It was inconsistently taught, so there were whole years where there was almost no input. And the result was very low input. There was nothing wrong with the students, not much wrong with the teachers, but the input was small. And we wrote it up, and he got his PhD and went home. And shortly after that, they changed the content of the curriculum. And this is what we're looking at now. So their curriculum now specifies exactly where they want to go and how they expect to do it in terms of vocabulary knowledge. So they expect to move progressively from A1, leading to A1, up to the cusp of A2, B1, by which time they're going to have 2,200 words. They're going to be learning about 4 words per hour, which we think is entirely feasible. And they changed their textbooks. So the textbooks, the old textbooks were thrown out. The new textbooks had to demonstrate they could create that amount of learning. And we then had students come in who wanted to look to see what the new textbooks did. And the interesting thing is that that they did. So we published one example with Ashwaq al-Sheikhi, she was called, another very bright student. And this was a textbook to get up to that 2,200 words of knowledge. It had 7,500 words of input. So a lot of input, spread much more widely across the frequency bands. It could scarcely not do that.
Yeah.
Much wider thematic content. And sure enough, actually, they got to the end of the learning with something more like 3,000 words. So nearly 50% knowledge. So these learners that look like complete duffers at the start of this process suddenly looked like rather good learners, and certainly comparable with learners anywhere else. The problem was never with the learners. The problem was with the input. The input
sounds like we're going probably the wrong way then in terms of our input. Narrowing our input and reducing it is probably the opposite of what we should be doing.
Yep. You've got to increase the input. And it's easy for me to sit here and say that. I've just retired. What do I care? But really, you do and you can, because the time is available to do that, even if you don't increase the number of hours. If you really want to get learners up to B1, then you have to make the right number of hours available. And that model we're looking at there has a good model of how to do it based on research about what we know rates of uptake will be. So that's how you do it. That's a good plan. And we know from looking at where this plan is applied properly, you get success.
Yeah, which is what we want.
Yeah.